My grandmother would go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and work until 2 in the afternoon every day. I remember in the summer, my brother and I would be out swimming or playing, but we would be home at 2 or 2:30 because my grandmother would come home from work around 2 and cook for our family. And she could cook. She would do that every day. She would come home and cook for us, lie down on the sofa for a few minutes, then go on back to work, 5 o'clock, dinner for them, the Gunn family. She did that for years. It was like taking care of 2 houses, but she never complained. My grandmother, Ida, was about 5'3". She walked with a limp. She got run over by a hit-and-run driver when she was about 16. Everybody knew who did it, but nothing ever happened. Nothing ever came of it. I learned from my grandparents and my mother, it's hard work. My grandmother would go to work all day for the Gunns. You knew she was tired, but she never complained. The next day she would start all over again. She cared for her family and she loved her family and she showed it. She worked hard for her family and for their family. I would venture to say that she probably gave as much care to cleaning and fixing meals for them as she did for us. That was just who she was. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, and great-aunts all did days' work. That's what people did. My grandmother didn't talk much about her work. She didn't tell many stories about it. I believe because when she came home, she was home. And when she went back to work, she was at work. She didn't drag a lot of stuff all over. Everybody in our house worked hard. My mother used to get home from her overnight job and take care of my great-grandmother until my grandmother would get home at about 2. Then my grandmother went back to work at 5. My grandfather, he worked all day, all his jobs too. But he was the one who would drive my grandmother to work, go back and pick her up and take her back, pick her up at night around 8 and bring her back. He never complained. There's a lot of work going on in that house, and nobody complained that there was too much of it. They just did it. Now, the Gunn family, whom my grandmother worked for, had a daughter, Raymie. She was adopted and kind of a brat to her parents. She was a handful, but my grandmother got along with her very well. Now, you would have to know my grandmother to know how she got along well there. She didn't have to scold Raymie or anything like that. I don't think she spanked her. She didn't have to. And my grandmother wasn't mean. She was straight. And you know what I mean? Straight. She was to speak to Raymie. Raymie, pull it in there, girl. And it would be pulled. Raymie was about 5 years older than us. The Gunn family bought her everything they thought she wanted to have. But she would get tired of it. And then we would get it. They bought her a jungle gym. She got tired of it. We got a jungle gym. They bought her a basketball court. She got tired of it. We got a basketball court. They bought her a swimming pool. Oh, no. I think my parents bought a swimming pool. The last thing she wanted them to buy her was an 18-wheeler. She wanted to go long-distance driving. We never got that 18-wheeler. But Raymie loved my grandmother. The whole family loved her. They were extremely nice to her, as well as respectful. They respected my grandmother. They didn't respect her, I'd guess that she wouldn't be working there very long. She was a no-nonsense person as you'd ever come up with. If my grandfather was here, he could tell you. He was kind of a handful himself. At one time, he said to grandmother, something. But grandmother, she would always keep him in check. My mother's friends would tell her, Mama Ida. They would call her Mama Ida. My grandmother was just that motherly type of person. She demanded respect when she walked into the room. You see, she didn't play. She was never ugly to anybody. She was just straight. My mom had a friend who had a son. We called him Chop. And my mom had to say, okay, I'm going to tell Mama Ida, you've been cussing. And he would straighten up. One time, we were playing, and Chop just let out, oh shit, it's hot in here. And my mom said, my mom told Grandma that Chop had been cussing. And she said, oh, I know better than that. All she had to do is tell Chop, I don't want you using that kind of language. But she did. My grandmother would cuss my grandfather out, Lord Jesus. You see, my grandfather had a truck. My brother and I would be in the back of the truck, and my grandfather would do some driving, and grandma would say, well, shit, Cephas. You know, bumping the road, running like. It was like watching a sitcom with those two. But she would be like that in him, and he would just say, yes, I. He was smart. Yes, I. You can't fight my grandmother. She was, as I say, just about as no-nonsense person as you could get. My grandfather, he owned a cafe and a fish market, but he lost both. Then he did janitorial work for a while and worked for a lawn service. He's already doing yard work for the Guns by this time, and they needed someone to cook and clean. My grandmother went to work for the Guns. And that's what my grandmother would say, I work for the Guns. And everybody would know that meant that she was the maid. Guns would periodically give stuff to us. Whatever it was, it made to the back of my grandfather's truck and on the top of our house on 4th Avenue. They would give my grandfather, Mr. Gunn's, suits and coats. This is one of them. A cashmere coat. My grandfather never wore it much. Only wore it to church. My grandfather. My grandmother died of cancer at age 56. The last week she lived was the last week she worked. The doctor told her on Monday it would be a miracle if she lived until Friday. And on that week, my brother was in summer school, and all the adults were working that day. So I was the only one home all day with my grandmother. I was 13. That Thursday, she got really, really sick. It was a rough week. I remember my grandmother paid me $5 to make her some coffee. I guess she wasn't supposed to have coffee. I don't know. But she said it was the best cup of coffee she ever had. The Gunn family came to the funeral at my grandmother's church, St. John's Missionary Baptist Church. She had been the church secretary and bookkeeper. She sang in the choir. I think she taught Sunday school too. Well, you know, every time we have a family funeral, every time, I always notice one white person in there. They're the people who they work for. Whose day's work was something else. All my grandmother wanted was for us to do better than she did. She wanted the kids and the family to do better than her. She wanted them to do better than she did. She would tell us, stay in school, get your lessons, get your work, so you don't have to do this. And it's true. I took all that motivation. I took all that motivation to take my career to the next level and do better. Each generation to do better than the next. The point of all this was so that my mom could go to college, My aunt could go to college, my other aunt could go to college, and my uncle could go to college. Now, my grandfather went to the 8th grade. Then he went back to night school to the 11th grade. He never finished. But my mom and my aunt and my other aunt and my uncle and all of my cousins, except for one, everybody went to FAMU. You know, it all comes together. I remember when I was younger, I had just got the job at WVTM in Birmingham in 1996. It gets cold in Birmingham. So I asked my grandfather, do you mind if I take your coat? It's cold in Birmingham. He said, sure, take it. So I took it. But I was about 60 pounds heavier. So I moved some of those buttons around. I put it on anyway, sure did. And I always loved that coat. And I always wore that coat. My grandfather only wore it mostly on Sundays. As a senior in high school, I never rented a tuxedo because my grandfather had one. I got his tuxedo and white dinner jacket. What did a man cutting grass need with a tuxedo? The Gunn family gave it to him. He just took it and put it in the closet. He never wore it. When I wear that coat, it reminds me of how much he put into it so that I would have a job where I would have to wear a coat like that. A coat like that. How about that? When I put on that coat, it reminds me of what he and all of them went through for me. If my grandmother hadn't worked so hard as she did, if my grandfather hadn't worked as hard as he did, I wouldn't have. Or the ability to wear it anywhere. And I've been a lot of places. I might be having that coat and wearing it only on Sundays. I'm very blessed, and I don't take that for granted. I really don't. It connects the past to the present in a crazy and funny, weird way. I guarantee you, when the Gunn family bought that coat, I didn't think anything of it. It was just a coat for the winter. Didn't mean anything. Not much. They didn't think anything of it, never knowing that in some point, in some way, that coat